My name is Marguerite Topping, and I live in Pawleys Island. I was recovering from chicken pox, eating Sunday breakfast in my bedroom when the siren went. And my mother and I sat and looked out of the window, howling with laughter at the people next door who were running back and forth to their Anderson shelter in the garden. Well, if there had been any bombs falling, they'd have been hit because they must have gone back and forth 20 times. Very amusing. However, from that point onwards, it was a matter of getting on with your daily living. Rationing began, and I worked in the City of London. I lost my job because I worked for the National Steam Navigation Company, and they plied between Britain and Europe. So after that, I went down to visit my girlfriend that I went to school with. She lived in Wiltshire. And while I was there, we were out walking one day, and we were machine gunned by a German who was returning from what they called a Baedecker raid on Bristol. And he machine gunned us. Well, we did the only thing we could do. We dived into the ditch. I must admit, we got the worst of it, because when we came out, we smelled of cows. It wasn't very easy getting back into town unseen. In the interim, my mother came down to visit a number of times, and one particular time, the train arrived, but no mother. So we waited for 3 or 4 more trains, because, of course, we didn't have individual telephones in those days either. So we waited for 3 or 4 more trains. Mother got off the train, extremely angry. The damn Germans had blown her windows out. So she had to stay at home and board up the windows before she could make the trip. And this basically was how life went. You never quite knew what was going to happen. You just took it in stride. You did the best you could, and that was it. I stayed in Wiltshire for about a year, and then I returned to London. And because my mother and father had managed to find an apartment, but only a small one, which made it more convenient for my father to get into the city where he worked, I decided I'd better find a job where I could live in, and I found a job, switchboard operator and clerk at the Hotel Russell in London. This worked very nicely. I had my own room, but I was only 20 minutes by subway from my parents, so this worked very nicely. There was only one thing that we did have a bit of a problem with. We had to do what they called fire watching. And once a week, I spent once a week on the roof looking for fire bombs. If we found them, we scooped them up, put them into a bucket, and doused the things, put them out before they set fire to the building. There was one evening, there was a group of us in my bedroom, happened to be looking out of the window, and someone said, "Oh, look, there's a parachute." Well, we thought someone had bailed out of their plane, but somebody else said, "That's not a person, that's a landmine hanging on that thing." Well, you've never seen anything so funny in your life. Here we are, about 6 people, and we all went tearing out of the room to run down the stairs, and I was on the 7th floor. Now, obviously, Had the thing landed, we'd have all been out of the business. But as it was, absolute miracle. The canopy of the parachute hooked on the uprights of an elevator shaft, and the bomb fell down the middle, hung down the middle. So, of course, we all had to get out, and we were all evacuated about 3 miles away, while the bomb disposal squad came and defused this thing. One day we had a wonderful dinner. We all had squab. I think everybody in London had squab that night because there'd been an air raid the night before and all the pigeons got killed. So in the morning, everybody, didn't matter what you were doing, you went out with a little bag and you picked up any dead pigeons you could find. The only thing was you had to watch out for shrapnel. It could make your teeth hurt. A group of us from the hotel decided to go dancing, and they had taken the Covent Garden Opera House and transformed this into a huge dance hall. So everybody we said, come on, we're going to Covent Garden dancing. So I hadn't been there myself before. However, my friend and I decided, well, we might as well go along because we didn't have anything else to do, so that was it. We sat up on the balcony, drank our lemonade, and decided, well, enough of this nonsense, let's go back to the hotel and read our books. So we started down from the balcony where we were sitting, and you had to cross the tip of the dance floor. And as we got to the bottom of the steps, someone that she knew approached her and asked her if she'd care to dance. And she looked at me and I said, well, naturally, go ahead. In the interim, I'm standing there feeling like a proper dodo. What do you do when you just single sitting to standing? And all of a sudden, this apparition appeared before me. I looked at him and I thought, I haven't a clue what you are or who you are, but by golly, I'll dance with you and find out. Turns out that he was an American soldier. He was in the 102nd Cavalry. He was wearing a riding habit, breeches, boots, the whole kit and caboodle with a bright yellow tie. And so we danced, and from that point onwards, we saw each other on a pretty regular basis, which was rather funny because this was in London. I joined the Navy shortly thereafter. I was sent to Plymouth, and he was sent to Plymouth. I was sent to a little town of Salcombe, and he was sent to Exeter. I was sent to Exmouth, and there we sat, maybe 10 miles apart, and came to the conclusion, you know, there's a bigger hand than ours in this, so we'd better get married. So we got married in February of 1944. My mother had told all the neighbors, you know, that Peggy was getting married, and surely they all chipped in whatever they could, and the local baker said he'd bake the cake. Well, we did. We had a wonderful cake, but basically that was it for the wedding wedding breakfast. The rationing, of course, throughout the war was very strict. We had 3 ounces of meat a week, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of lard. If you got bacon, that was just a sheer fluke. Sausage meat was made with soybeans and blew up when you tried to cook it. You started with a patty and you finished up with a 10-inch pan full of something and you ate it. because it was edible. The bread was a greyish colour, sort of greyish tan, but it was good. But again, it was made, we literally lived on soybeans, I think, during the war. And they came in various forms, but basically that was it. Sugar, 2 ounces of sugar a week. Tea, 2 ounces a week. Coffee, if you were lucky, you found some. It wasn't easy, but you got used to it. Of course, everything that you ate in the way of fruits and vegetables was very fresh because they didn't import any. So whatever you ate was in season and grown in Great Britain, and that was it. We got married, and then that was in February of 1944. In April, I had to go to my commanding officer and advisor that I thought I was going to have a baby. So I was duly sworn out of the Navy, and that was on June the 4th of 1944. My husband took part in D-Day in Omaha Beach 2 days later. It was very fascinating because I could see the British Channel, and I could see all the boats going. It was a wonderful sight, wonderful. So anyway, I stayed with my mother and father in London and went to the American Embassy and said, I understand that you are sending people to America, dependents to America. Yes, but we're only sending those that have husbands in England. So my reply was, well, that's ridiculous. They know what's happening to their wives. My husband's watching them send bombs to England. I think he should have more peace of mind. Well, we can't do anything. I said, all right, I'll see you day after tomorrow. So every other day from that point onwards, that was from the end of June, from that point onwards, every other day I went to the American Embassy. They had to see me. I wore them out because, September, I received a chit that said I could travel to America. So it said that I was allowed 1 trunk and 1 piece of hand luggage, and that the trunk was to be sent to Addison Street Station in London. I hadn't a clue where that was. Obviously, it was, some little, what do you call it, place where they shipped goods from rather than people. Then it said that I was to be there at 8 o'clock on the 8th of October. So my mother said, I'll walk up to the underground station with you, which she prepared to do. My father, unfortunately, was too upset. He said, I can't do it. Mind if I say goodbye here? So we said goodbye at home. And Mother walked up to the station with me, and we got about halfway when the siren went. And I said to her, well, you'd better turn around and run back home, and I'll run for the station. So we had beautiful leather handbags with a zipper right across the top. So I said, undo the zipper and pull the bag on your head, at least at the shrapnel. You'll protect yourself. She said, you do the same. Well, you've never seen anything so silly as these 2 women, one running one running the other with their handbags jammed on their heads. But I got to the station successfully, and eventually I got to this Addison Street station, which happened to be in Kensington, the far side of London. And then we gathered on the platform, and about 2 hours later, a taxi cab arrived with two rather inebriated gentlemen that got out. But they said, "We've got sandwiches. We've also got thermos jugs. We've got one with tea and one with coffee." So we looked at each other. There was a little group of us standing together, and we nodded and said, "Right, they're ours." So we promptly took them by the arm, steered them to our compartment on the train, and we figured if anyone's going to get sandwiches and drinks, we were. So that was it. That was fun. So these two dear souls sobered up, and they went through the train dispensing their tea and coffee and sandwiches. They somehow got up to the engine and got fresh hot water so they could refill these jugs, which they did throughout the night. In the morning we stopped at Crewe, so they tidied themselves up and went up to the local NAFI, which was, this was a group during the war that used to make sure that you got your tea and a bun or something to eat. They went up and said, "Oh, we're in charge of this train, you know, and all these people. You must feed them breakfast." So we all got a bun and something to drink for breakfast. Turns out that they were representatives from Lockheed Hudson and were returning to America. They weren't even military, but of course they wore military uniforms for traveling. No insignia. The next thing you know, we pulled up in Gourock, Scotland. And there we were taken by tender to the Aquitania, which was one of the Cunard liners. She had been commissioned in 1913 and used during the First World War as a hospital ship. Second World War, she was bound for the scrapyard, and they said, "No, she's still in good shape. Fix her up." So, again, for the Second World War, the little old Aquitania served as a hospital ship. There were 600 wounded on board, 200 of whom were mobile. The others were bedridden. There was 35 ATS girls, that's the English Army, and these girls were going to Canada for training. There were 12 war brides, and the rest were returning personnel, returning to the United States. And they, with the American Red Cross, took care of these fellas that were bedridden all the way across. We had the 2 thermos jugs and made sure we had bags, and every morning we would get the thermos jugs filled, and we'd put rolls or biscuits or whatever into the things and take them up on deck. And there we would meet the walking wounded. We also had a phonograph, little portable phonograph, and 12 records. We played those 12 records right the way across the Atlantic Ocean. We knew every song that Peggy Lee had recorded on it. And by the time we eventually got to America, believe me, we were thoroughly sick of them. The fellas that came up on deck, as I say, these were walking wounded. They were arms, legs. One fellow was shot through the neck. very, very fortunate. The missile, whatever had hit him, had gone through one side and out the other, but missed the carotid artery. So he was very, very fortunate. And so I'd say it was a very interesting journey, to put it mildly. We arrived in New York, because we sailed alone. We had no convoy, because the old ship, God bless her, she could still outrun U-boats, and there were U-boats still out there. So we arrived in New York City on the 16th of October, and we were told, we were taken, there were 5 war brides that were expecting families. We were taken off one end of the boat and told to sit on the dock on our luggage, and someone would come and pick us up. So we sat on the end of the dock from 8:30 at night till 3:30 in the morning, and eventually someone from the American Red Cross approached us and said, "Are you the she-dogs that stole our men?" This was our welcome to America. Not very nice. So that night, we went to the Travelers Aid Society place on 42nd Street, and because I was only going to New Jersey, I was told to sleep on a couch that was 18 inches wide and covered with leather. Believe me, it wasn't easy being pregnant and trying to perch on an 18-inch wide couch. So the following morning they sent a note over to my in-laws that I had arrived. And of course, by the time they got the message, it was the following morning before they could come and get me. By then I was thoroughly tired. But they were charming people, wonderful people. And with them was a girl that I had been writing to. She had been a friend of my husband's. They'd gone to school together. And she, God bless her sweetheart, she had sent me a layette in England, and she also had one ready for me in the United States. We are still the best of friends after all these years. Dear soul. I lived with my in-laws, and the baby was eventually born in December the 27th, and then in July of 1945, my husband returned to the United States, and his feet had been very severely frostbitten in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. So, but that began my life in this country. We lived in Newark, New Jersey, and he worked for an insurance company. When they announced that they were going to train people to be psychiatric technicians at the local hospitals, that is, county hospitals in New Jersey. So he and a number of other fellows that I presume had all been medics during the war were accepted. And the first class did a psychiatric nursing course in 1 year. If they hadn't been medics, they couldn't have done it, but this worked out fine. So we lived in this beautiful park, and we were very, very fortunate. We had 1/3 of a single-story barracks. So we had a 2-bedroom apartment were one of the very, very few people in 1945 that had their own home, because fellas coming back to this country at that time, you either lived with your in-laws or doubled up with someone else and all the rest of it. So we were lucky. I must say, from that point onwards, things just got gradually better and better, and we finished up with 4 delightful children, 3 boys and a girl, and I have no regrets whatsoever. I've loved every minute of it. When they first started bombing the air raids, you'd see the searchlights and you could spot the planes up in the sky. And as I say, from the age of 16, I was a fire watcher. I was up on the roof looking for bombs. And you just did this. They dropped these wretched bombs, and you did the best you could. A friend of mine, not too long ago, put it very aptly, I think. She said, you know, we lived in a kindler, gentler time when we were young. Now, this sounds funny. Here we were, being bombed, no food, or precious little, and what there was pretty horrible. But we were kind to each other, we helped each other. We weren't vicious. We didn't say, I'm okay, to heck with you. No, are you all right? This is the way it was. If you managed to get some fruit or something, you made sure you shared it, because you knew that if the situation was reversed, it would be the same. Now, a lot of people did go to the air raid shelters, but in London, 90% of them used the underground stations. These were deep, well constructed. They took their beds. That's where they went for the night. Yes, but in England, particularly in the towns, prior to the war, most of the men had what they called an allotment. In other words, it was an allotment of land that they could use as garden. Of course, if you lived in the country, you had your own garden, that was it. As I say, the things that you grew were pretty darn basic. You made sure you had greens, beans, peas, and things like that. Carrots, onions. As far as I can remember, we did get seeds during the war that that you could use for planting. And otherwise, you saved your own and replanted next year. And so that, you know, if it hadn't have been for these extra gardens, your local supplier could never have done it. As far as meat was concerned, as I say, we got 3 ounces of meat a week. If you were lucky, every now and then you'd get a chicken, because someone came back from the country and they brought you one. You never saw them in the stores. Oh, in the beginning, people my parents' age were not too thrilled, because he'd pulled some awful clangers when he was a younger man, did some very foolish things. And as the war progressed, we realized he was the best. You couldn't get anything better. He was very positive, forward-looking, refused to be knocked down or dragged down by all this nonsense. I can't say the same, though, for the man that was the Minister of Food. He came up with some of the worst possible recipes. They were ghastly. But Churchill, as I say, he was a very positive figure, and he was a very loved figure. Oh, they were the most gorgeous creatures we'd ever seen. They were. I loved them, very frankly. I was very fortunate. Because I worked at a hotel, I first met Canadians, and Mother and Dad living just 20 minutes away, I took them home. Because the poor lads, while they were in a hotel, they had to be in full uniform all the time. So I took them home and introduced them to my parents. Said, okay, catch the train, this is where you get off, and that's it. So when the Canadians moved on, Americans took their place in the hotel, and the Canadians immediately said, oh, come along, we're going to take you down to meet Mr. and Mrs. Kidd. You'll like them, and they'll like you. And from that point onwards, my mother and father had a steady stream of Americans who used to come down at least once a week to visit. They loved it because they could take off their ties, throw their jackets in the closet. We had a piano for those that played. It was, my father loved it, loved talking to these boys, thought they were the most wonderful creatures that ever populated the earth. And rather a funny story, he went to the library one day, and two ladies, the other side of the shelf that he was looking at, were talking about this frightful hussy of a woman that was always walking down the road with different Americans every week, different Americans. My father stuck his head around the corner and said, oh, you're talking about my daughter. And by the way, those are my friends. Deadly silence, and that was the end of that little conversation. But Mother and Dad loved it. And long after I had left home, they still continued to go home to visit with Mother and Dad. They knew people I have never met, but they loved it. They did what they could. They didn't have anything to offer except take your jacket off, do what you like. My father, of course, had a dartboard rigged up. They played cards, darts. As I say, there was the piano. Radio was, well, there was music, but you didn't really have a choice. You just listened to whatever was being broadcast, and that was it. But it was. One of the things that Mother and Dad loved about having the boys come to see them, though, was they actually got soap to wash with. Because if we were lucky, now and then you'd get a bar of soap, but it'd be some strange and wondrous thing. Might even be Lifebuoy Carbolic, or something like that. But this way, the boys would bring them down. Mother said she got to the point where she was looking for her soap to come because, ooh, it smelled so good. And so, as I say, it was a kindly, gentler time. We were nice to each other. And I think the reason was you were nice to each other because you enjoyed each other's company, and you didn't know whether you'd be there tomorrow. I used to take my children home every other year, and I was fortunate enough that I always travelled on a Cunard line. I belonged to a group of women who were war brides from all over the world, and we could take the plane. But I said, if you think I'm getting on a plane with a bunch of women with a bunch of children all squalling, no way. So what I would do, I would go every other year, but then I went for 3 months. And I got on to the QE2 or the Queen Mary, smiled sweetly at the stewardess and said, take me, I'm yours. And from that point onwards, it was great. I was watched over, my babies were watched over, and it was absolutely gorgeous. And I had this really fine vacation. My husband would come about every third trip, he'd come. And it was great. In fact, we lived so close to New York City that we grew to know the people on these boats, and they would come and visit with us. When the ship docked, we'd get a phone call and say, "Hoy, can we come over?" And they'd come and visit with us, and it was great. So made some very dear friends too that way. I was a signal woman. I used radio, phone, radar, you name it. We were part of Combined Ops, which was laying the pipeline over to Omaha Beach, and we were the other end of it. And of course we had to keep our eye on the channel and make sure that everything was okay. Oh, buzz bombs were horrible things. These were the V1s. And they were without a doubt the most miserable form of armament that was ever invented, because you'd hear them coming over. They droned, but with a sort of a throb, and all of a sudden the engine would stop. And you hadn't a clue. They could either drop straight down, turn left, turn right, or go straight ahead. So you didn't know until it actually hit what was happening. V2s were much better. They did a lot more damage, but by golly, when their engine stopped, you knew what was going to happen, you know, and basically that was it. But the V1s, nasty things, very nasty. My aunt and uncle lived on the Isle of Sheppey, which is on the Thames coming up to London. And I asked her one time, I said, "Have you had much damage from the buzz bombs?" "No, they miss us. We're around the corner." Well, I thought that was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. But basically, if they were using the Thames as a guideline, they were tucked just around the corner. And these wretched things all went past them. But they were, as I say, they were so nasty because despite the fact that they didn't go fast, they were a pretty darn small target if you were trying to hit them. And you never knew what they were going to do. We were out in the country, quite a way out of town, I would say 2 or 3 miles out of town, out in the middle of the country, and all of a sudden this airplane came over and dive bombed and machine gunned us. And it was a German plane that was returning from Bristol. We assumed it was Bristol because that's the logical place. this is what they used to call Baedeker raids. This was a touring company in Europe, and the Germans were basically going to towns of interest or places of interest and bombing. And why in the world? He must have had, the only thing we could think was that he had ammunition. He thought he'd better get rid of some of it. So he saw some people walking and he machine gunned them. The fact that we happened to be two young ladies with a little girl, about 4, didn't matter. My grandmother raised rabbits. She used to use Belgian hares, which were big rabbits, but these were strictly for the table. In fact, I have a picture of my grandmother taken when she was 86 years of age with a handful of thistles and a big grin on her face because she just got the thistles to feed her bunnies. But yes, if it wasn't for rabbits and hares and whatnot, life would have been a lot duller than it was, because at least every now and then you could have a nice roast rabbit, and I think most of the women did the same thing. They made a stuffing to go with it, and you couldn't have a chicken because chickens laid eggs, so therefore you didn't get chickens. How did I come to South Carolina? My husband and I were sent to Yap, which was in the trust territories, which were being administered by the United States. That was in the early 70s. So he was contracted to do some road work and build a dock and various and sundry other things. And I worked for the Public Works Department as a stenographer. Then I worked for the Education, Department of Education. And that was fun. It was fun. It was very nice. I had 3 mango trees, and I had to hire my housekeeper's little grandson to sit up in the trees because the natives liked to eat them before they got ripe. And I said, no way, not my mangoes, you don't. And that was fun. But then we went from Yap. This is where they have stone money, by the way, and it's still used as legal tender. If I wanted to buy a piece of property from you, you'd say, right, I want that wheel of money. And I don't know, are you familiar with the story about Captain O'Keefe, who sailed from Savannah? Okay, Captain O'Keefe sailed from Savannah, and they went out to the islands, and the man that he sailed with said, well, are you okay now? And he said yes, and he got off, and he eventually married a local woman at Palau, and he brought her to the island of Yap, where he built a very beautiful home, and he took the natives who always used canoes to go to Palau to get money. And the money was white quartz, and they had cliffs of it. So they'd paddle merrily down 500 miles, get the quartz, and they'd cut it in big wheels and with a hole in the middle and stick a bamboo pole through it. And this they bring back, stick it across the canoe and paddle 500 miles back. So the money was very, very prized. And the bigger piece you got, will you got, because obviously the more it was worth. And you go down through the villages, and the big wheels of money shows you how rich that village is. That's how you know. And if you want to buy something, you'd have to pay with a wheel of money. If you were particularly land, you'd have to pay with a wheel of money. So everybody guarded their money very, very assiduously, and everybody knew which wheel belonged to whom. And they were lovely people. They were the sweetest, gentlest people that you ever did meet. Lovely people. And then from there, we went up to Guam, and from Guam, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the island. It's the Marianas anyway. So we went to the Marianas, and we were there for 4 months before returning to the United States. And while we were trying to make up our mind where to return to the United States, I said, I don't ever want to see snow again, and I certainly don't want to drive in it. And my husband said, well, okay, I feel the same way. So one of our neighbors said, well, I used to be at Shore Air Force Base, and that's where we're going back to Sumter. And he said, you'd like it there, it's a nice country. So we wrote to all the towns we could find in the state of South Carolina that had a population of 10,000 or more. And we eventually, we came home, and we stayed with these very dear friends. And every day we would take a trip and go and look at another town. Well, in the end, we came to the conclusion we liked the town that we went through to get to these other places better than we liked them. But the only thing was, when we looked at our little piece of paper, it said that the total population was 2,500. Well, as it turned out, that was of the city itself, and the town was Camden. Well, because Greater Camden, considerably bigger. And I think it was a very, very good place for someone new to come to, because there was the big DuPont plant just up the road. So you had a lot of people there that were not native Carolinians. And the people in town itself, again, a lot of them were transplants from somewhere else, but delightful people, great people. Mrs. Buckley used to clean the Catholic Church every morning. And she was a great lady, really wonderful. And then there was Mrs. DuPont Scott. She married Randolph Scott, and she was responsible for the beautiful racetrack that's there. And we had such fun at the racetrack too. We used to go to both meets each year, and it was the biggest party you ever did see. I mean, people had, some of them brought tables, some even brought candelabra. But it was wild, and it was great. When I'd worked for the Kershaw County School while we lived in Camden, and when I retired, I decided I wanted to live at the seaside. I miss the sea terribly. So in the interim, my husband and I had decided to go our separate ways. So I came down, and I lived in Murrells Inlet for 10, 12 years. And then I found this very nice little apartment in Pawleys, and it suits me fine, and I love it, and that's it.